Okay, we're at the hour, on the hour, and it's a fantastic pleasure to welcome both the core team that is having its monthly coordination call. So for everybody who's interested in this, please see our website, as well as for all our additional guests who will come out in the next minutes, or the people who are watching this as a recording. Very warm welcome to a knowledge share session with Michele Zanini about from managing performance to unleashing potential, lessons from the Vanguard. And I'm very, very proud to introduce Michele, who is not only a good friend, but also a fantastic thinker, and of course, a co-author with Gary Hamel of this very a Wall Street Journal bestseller, Humanocracy. But Michele has done a lot more in this past. He's come from the Rand Corporation. He's worked on public sector improvements. He's worked with McKinsey on private companies and done a lot of investigation there, how to make companies more agile. He's an expert on Rand and Haye and Hire. They've both worked together with Hire to figure out what's happening in those companies. So Michele brings a wealth of insights and, shall I say, a streak of radical management innovation. So I'm much looking forward to hearing more about some examples that have inspired Michele in regards to performance management. Michele, a warm welcome to you. And a quick look at the wider project. We started this performance management transformation challenge at the HR Congress last year in Amsterdam. There were a whole bunch of lovely people. You can see some of the faces who joined this effort. And if you are interested in coming with us on this journey, please just go to the website, leadershipsociety.world/academy, making business flourish, I think, and join us. It's a non-for-profit endeavor. It's colleagues for colleagues, so to speak. And I will just call out John Ingham. I think John is on the call, who is kind of one of the advisors and HR experts who are accompanying us in this charge, amongst many other colleagues who are joining us as well. And I would also like to briefly present Rebecca Tillery. I call her Becky, who is the project lead for this project. So if you've got any questions on how to engage, Becky is there for you as well. Finally, a warm invitation to the HR Congress. So we're working hand in hand with the HR Congress team to present everything that we find out throughout the next 3 months at the HR Congress. Our goal is to create a new performance management manifesto that people can take away and experiment with. And we are searching for companies who are willing to engage with us. If you know about a company, or if you're willing to join in a set of experiments around new performance management practices, including pay, please let us know. This will be an effort guided by Antoinette and the University of St. Gallen, so you can expect academic quality and expertise, and maybe also something for you to learn from that, but maybe also for some of the things you experiment with to share with the wider world of HR for the good of all. And a final word, and then I'm all done with the introduction. How is this going to work? So we started in January by creating a vision statement for what it means to make companies flourish. We're going to do research on the effectiveness of old practices in performance management. We will do research on the innovation and performance management, seek to analyze that together with the whole group of experts and colleagues, and then crystallize the manifesto for presentation at the HR Congress to start the pilots. That's the overarching umbrella for the project. And with that, the introduction is over, and the long-awaited discussion is going to start.
Well, thank you, Ati, and hello, everyone. I'm really grateful to have the chance to share a few thoughts on how we might reimagine performance management in a way that encourages both individual flourishing as well as institutional vitality. I don't have to tell you, right, this audience, that performance management is an evergreen topic. Every few years or so, the pages of business magazines like HBR or Fortune are graced with hopeful pronouncements about how performance management will finally be brought into the 21st century. But the fact of the matter is, we're pretty much still stuck with a process that is quite traditional and that few people are happy about. There's plenty of data suggesting that traditional performance management processes are simply inefficient and don't add a lot of value, right? Here's evidence I've gathered from a variety of sources on what employees think. You've probably seen versions of this, and I'll let you scan it quickly. And here's another set of data, and this is from HR executives and leaders, right, and other leaders who also seem to agree with the claim that HR performance management isn't particularly helpful. So it seems to me this is a pretty ripe target for organizational innovation, right? But I reckon we're not going to make a lot of progress in this area unless we begin by challenging some of the core assumptions of our performance management approach, right? And I think it's helpful to do some deconstruction of terms here. And let's start with the managing bit, of managing performance. Whenever you hear the word management, what is the synonym that comes to mind, right? I'll let you think about that for a second. For me, and perhaps for many of you, the synonym, the closest word to manage is to control, right? And performance management is mostly a control compliance driven exercise, and it's fairly hierarchical. That's where control comes from, right? From hierarchy. And that's not very surprising because that's what managers do. They're supposed to manufacture control. That in a way is their core mission. Consider that, despite the hype, boss-driven performance reviews are still the dominant factor of in the way performance management works. Like 99% of employees polled in a recent Gartner survey indicated that that's where most of the evaluative input comes from, your boss. Less than 20%, about 17%, claimed that teams played a role in evaluating employees, but that weight is nowhere near as important as it is of the supervisor. Now, evaluating performance via the managerial chain of command introduces a variety of distortions, both on the part of the rater. There are all sorts of biases and favoritism at play, and there's a long literature on that. But also on the part of the person being rated, right? There's a lot of fear and self-censorship. And so we persist, despite all these problems with the current system. We maybe tweak around the edges. We have monthly check-ins with our boss, which are probably a really good idea. But, I doubt they really remove the structural problems that I was mentioning earlier. So that's on the managing side. So given that hierarchical control-driven orientation, it's not surprising that whatever performance is being managed is fairly narrow. Often it's a set of KPIs that have been defined for you or for your team, and a lot of these are backward-looking since it's hard to control the future, right? So often there's a lot of energy devoted to managing the is, and not so much about pursuing performance that could be, right? And by the way, on the KPI front, let me just share a quick story from a friend of ours, Jim Snaber. He's the former CEO of SAP and chairman of Siemens. He wrote a wonderful book called Dreams and Details, which I encourage you to check out. But in a recent conversation we had with him, Jim mentioned that when he left SAP, the company had 5,000 KPIs across the whole organization. And he was not bragging, right? The organization believed somehow that if we could define KPIs for every role, if we could cascade these, if we could disaggregate success in all these individual tasks and goals, somehow we could reaggregate them all back to success. And, that might be true in a steady state world, maybe. But what guarantees success today isn't what guarantees success tomorrow, right? And so this kind of approach isn't going to work. And this is what Jim said that happened, right? As they kind of managed through all these KPIs, we were basically putting all our brains on ice, so a colossal waste of human capacity. So given this, I believe that we could all do ourselves a favor, right, by just getting rid of this idea of managing performance and really committing ourselves to building structures and processes that unleash human potential. And this is a very broad project on which I I wrote a whole book about. So, and it goes well beyond today's conversation. So for now, let's focus on the elements that are in play when one thinks about traditional performance management, right? So specifically, how should we reimagine how goals are set, how they translate into specific targets at the unit and individual level, how performance is appraised, how that feeds into compensation, and the role that improvement and development play in elevating performance, right? So this sounds, even though we're looking at performance management and not the entirety of the organization, it's still like a pretty big task, and in many ways it is, but a growing number of companies that have departed from the traditional playbook of performance management show that it's entirely doable. Yeah, not only that, not only do they get better performance by kind of ignoring the conventional wisdom, but they also help individual flourish at work, right? So I'm going to spend the rest of this presentation by just giving you a quick overview of how some of these organizations work along these practices, and we're going to work through this little framework. And one thing to keep in mind as a bit of a caveat, while there are some overlapping practices that I'm going to mention to you, there's no single recipe. So what you really should take away from these examples is inspiration and confidence that you can explore alternatives that are radically different from the status quo. What you should not take away from this is a kind of a cut and paste approach, a recipe that is universal. This is the key really to learn from these Vanguard organizations is much more around how they think as opposed to what they do. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. And so with that as a little context, let's jump in, and let's start with goal setting. And let me maybe start with an experiment, for you. So pull together your organization's latest annual report, its mission statement, or a transcript of a CEO speech, or to look at these documents and do a little bit of a content analysis. What are the words that pop up the most, right? There are probably things like advantage, leadership, differentiation, efficiency, accountability. And there's nothing wrong with these kinds of words, right? But do they quicken your pulse, right? Do they speak to your heart? Are they good in some sort of cosmic sense? And chances are the answer is no. But there's no reason why that shouldn't be the case. One of the most underrated ways of unleashing the potential of every associate in an organization is to embrace a mission and a set of objectives that are noble and create real stretch. A noble purpose inspires sacrifice, stimulates innovation, encourages perseverance. Stretch objectives stimulate innovation, right? They give you're never going to outrun your aspiration, and you're going to find all sorts of ways to try to bridge that gap between your resources and where you need to be. Take for instance Buurtzorg, which is the leading in-home health services in the Netherlands. I'm assuming many of you are familiar with it, so I'm just going to give you a little bit of a snippet of how they work. But keep in mind they're large. They have about 11,000 nurses, and they're organized in about 1,000 teams. And I'll come to that a little bit later. But not only are they large, they're also highly performing. So if you look at their results on the counts of patients, of the employees themselves, of the efficiency that they generate, and so on. So they're a highly performing organization, and they'll be the first to tell you that a big reason for this is their mission, their ethos, which is this: humanity over bureaucracy. Now, this is the glue that connects all teams around the shared mission. It's also an appeal to professional ethics, to do what's right for the patient, to see the patient, help the patient as a whole person. And it's also seen by many of the nurses as kind of a cause, right? To create a healthcare system that is not as subjected to the tyranny of excessive metrics and mandates and management. They do see themselves as nurses that work at Buurtzorg as part of a freedom movement, right, for the healthcare industry. And they draw enormous energy and guidance from being part of this noble cause. So that's one example. Let me give you a completely different one. And this is SpaceX. Now, you may or may not be fans of Elon Musk, but I think it's hard to argue that SpaceX is doing amazing things. And arguably they take the title for the most stretch mission, right, for a company that I've seen to date, taking us to other planets as a civilization. And, Elon Musk and other members of SpaceX understand that without this kind of bold aspiration, you don't get the bold thinking, like the idea of using rockets more than once, right? Now, last year, SpaceX launched a rocket every 4 days and has driven the price per kilo of space cargo by about 90%. That's simply amazing. So the point here is very simple. No organization outperforms its aspiration. And when organizations stall out, especially large ones, it's not so much because they have resource constraints and more because they kind of ran out of ambition and imagination. The mission is also a powerful source of motivation and alignment. And I recently came across this amazing quote from a SpaceX engineer, right? So our mission is to become a multiplanetary species. To do that, we need to go to Mars. To do that, we need to build a big rocket, Starship. For that to happen, we need to have a much more powerful engine. For that to happen, we need to have this particular valve assembly work. My mission is to optimize this valve, right? So there's complete line of sight between the mission of the company and the person's role. It's simply amazing. And so a deeply resonant mission and stretch objectives not only inspire, but they also produce alignment and control. It's internal, it's intrinsic. It's not imposed through an overbearing administrative structure. It's not an exaggeration to say that, the mission is the boss. Okay, let's shift to our second element, which is unit and personal targets. Even organizations that give people a lot of autonomy operate with targets. It's pretty straightforward. Every organization needs to have targets to function properly. The question is what kind of targets and at what level. In many of the organizations that succeed in unleashing the talent and of their people, right, and that maximize collective accomplishment, everybody feels like they're working in their own business. They're not like a small cog in a big machine. And this translates into setting performance targets that are at the level of small operating units and making these units responsible for fully fledged P&Ls, or as close as you can get to that. So this is how things work at Haier, for instance, the world's largest appliance maker. In their Chinese operations, about 50,000 people work in 4,000 micro enterprises, each with clear line of sight to the customer. And their targets are mainly about revenue and margins, and they are expressed as a multiple of a particular benchmark, like industry growth in the case of revenues. So they're pretty true, right, to whether the business is being successful or not, and they're not like derivative or arbitrary. They can't be game, and because they're expressed as a multiple, let's say you have to grow at 5x the industry, they also imply real stretch. Another large, high-performing company that has a similarly disaggregated P&L-driven approach is Vinci. They employ about 280,000 people in over 120 countries. They're based in France, but they're a global company, and they operate toll roads, airports, high-speed rail lines, sports venues. They build big structures and small structures alike, and they also take on hundreds of thousands of energy projects around the world. And all this activity is performed by about 4,000 compact business units, most of which actually have less than 100 people working in there. And they are expected, these units, to deliver P&L results, but the specific and a particular level of profitability, but the specific way to get there and specific targets to set is all done kind of bottom up. And these units are responsible for generating their business plans, for hiring people, for finding customers, and so on. And they have very little corporate overhead, and they often get started kind of from the bottom up. Someone has an idea, let's start an airport business in Cambodia, and then, in fact, that's how the whole concession business started. Some person in Cambodia saying we should operate the airport here. That happens. Surfaces bubble up, and when the business unit become too big, they get split into smaller ones. So it's kind of an interesting process, like cellular division. And about 10% of the units turn over every year, either because they get disbanded or they get separated, or they get created. So there's a highly dynamic entrepreneurial system in place. Even Buurtzorg, which I mentioned before, has a cellular structure with 1,000 teams responsible for their own performance. Every Buurtzorg team is given a territory with a population of about 10,000 people, and they're responsible for finding clients, for renting space, for recruiting, for budget, for accounting, and constantly improving the quality and efficiency of the care. So they do this in their own little teams, which is a small business. And so the whole company is essentially a community of small businesses. Now, Buurtzorg is a nonprofit, so they're not really managing a P&L, but they're certainly responsible for the economics of the business. In their case, it's really about utilization, how much time they spend working with clients and for which they can build the insurance company for, and their utilization target is about 60%. So below that, you as a team, you're a drag on the economics of Buurtzorg. If you're far above that, that could also be a problem, right? Because you might be overstretched, you might be burning out, you may be not spending enough time with clients, in case they have unscheduled emergencies. And so, but it's really up to the team at the local level to find that balance and find that trade-off, right? And so I think they give you a good sense of how you can create this deep sense of ownership anywhere, including a healthcare nonprofit, right? And one side note I wanted to leave you with before we go on to the next section is this, that all these Vanguard organizations are highly disaggregated. And I don't think that's an accident. It's the result of a commitment to keep the operating unit at a human scale where, it's people say we decide, not they decide, right? And this helps with motivation as well as accountability, right? And it allows these organizations to remain vital as they grow. All right. Now let's turn to the third element, which is performance appraisal. We talked earlier about the ills of the boss-driven performance review, as well as the benefits of making the mission your boss. Many companies use two other non-hierarchical ways to review performance, and I wanted to kind of unpack them for you here. The first is customer feedback, and that's certainly true for the market-facing unit I mentioned before. Market success is the ultimate gauge, whether a team at Buurtzorg or at Hire or even at VC, whether they're viable or not, right? There's no like multi-dimensional competency model to test whether you are effective. You either are able to self-sustain or not. That's pretty clear cut. But firms like Hire take it a step further. They also create a strong sense of customer accountability deep in the organization, not just in the customer-facing unit. Let me just spend a minute on this, because Hire's micro enterprises all come together in a web of contracts. So if, let's say, you're the team in charge of making a new refrigerator, maybe one with a larger freezer, right? And you tap into, at that point, when you have that intention, into an internal market for services. So you'll put out a bid for design, for manufacturing, for service resources, delivery, and so on. And there are multiple teams from each of these functional areas, let's say manufacturing or design, that could help you, right? And so they will give you proposals, and then you select the one that you think is best, right? And so you enter into a contractual agreement where it specifies what they need to do, right? And if you are not delivering on the contract, you get docked, or you might even get replaced with another unit if you're not performing at the level you committed to, right? And I've met a lot of HR leaders who say that they're focused on their internal customers, and my question to them is often, well, can they fire you, right? And because if they're not really your customer, right? So you may not go that far in your organization where literally everybody has an internal customer and there's a contractual arrangement the way Hire does. But in general, there should be far stronger feedback and accountability mechanisms for the provision of internal services. Now, the more interesting thing for me about Hire's model is that it's not just a set of bilateral connections between different teams in the organization, but it's more of a lattice of shared customer-driven activities and targets. So in addition to your performance, let's say your R&D node or design node, your performance is not just a function of how well you fulfill your contractual arrangement and obligations, but how the whole network of units working on that particular product or service, how that does in the marketplace, right? So even if you did all the right things, but the product tanks, you're going to get a hit for that. So even if you're in the back office, right, even if you're manufacturing, your performance is partly driven on whether customers love what you did. And this creates a lot of incentives to be very responsive to the needs of the customers, irrespective of where you sit. And it spurs a lot of collegiality and collaboration because, in a way, you're all in this together. So, which is why Hire's longtime chairman, Jean Gourmin, is only partly joking when he says that everybody at Hire reports to the customer, right? So reporting to the mission, or in the case of SpaceX or Buurtzorg, but also reporting to the customer, right? Now, let me give you another direction in which accountability can flow, which is laterally, peer-based. And I'll give you this example, and it comes from W.L. Gore. They make thousands of products, including Gore-Tex and guitar strings and many others, and they employ about 11,000 people. And they were founded in the late 50s by Bill Gore, and he had this vision of creating a company based on natural leadership. So he didn't think that leadership, Bill Gore didn't, could be bestowed by a hierarchical position. You are a leader; people want to follow you, right? And so he then thought about, like, how do I create a system, right, where people are able to enter into commitments with one another, to work together, to lead and to be led, right? And it's a very interesting story of how that works. I'm just going to give you the particular aspect, which is around evaluating performance, right? Because how do you evaluate performance in an environment where people are free to make their own commitments, free to make their own decisions, are free to tell you, no, I don't want to work with you, I don't want to follow you, right? And so they created this very interesting process, and I'm going to describe it quickly. So once a year, every associate is asked to compile a list of 5 to 20 colleagues who have firsthand knowledge of their work. So these nominations are then used in a peer rating process based on pairwise comparison. So for instance, assume that Oti and I both list Antoniette as a potential reviewer. In this case, another one will identify the match, and then Antoniette will be asked to indicate which one of us, will has contributed more to Gore's success of the preceding year. Obviously, in this case, it would be Oti, right? But thousands of these comparisons are collected across the company and aggregated to create a contribution ranking for every associate. So you get evaluated against other peers multiple times, right? And that creates a kind of a natural hierarchy of contribution. Now, this input, this ranking of contribution is then calibrated by local committees that want to ensure that the individual's pay reflects the peer derived ratings and also stays in sync with pay of similarly rated employees. So for instance, if in that year the average comp increase is 4%, the increase with someone who has a high rating might be 15%, right? So it stays within a particular range. Now, this kind of peer-based compensation system, evaluation system, is very interesting, right? Because it pushes everyone to think about how they could add more value. The system, in a way, encourages collaboration. You understand as at Gore that you're reporting to your peers, right? And so they're going to value your whether or not you added value or you helped them, and so you're going to be more inclined to go the extra mile where it makes sense. And Gore really wants the energy of every employee to be invested in building the business, as opposed to kind of winning these promotion tournaments that are typical of a hierarchy, where there are only so many spots up the chain you can move into. All right, I hope you're with me so far. Let's keep going. We're more than halfway there. And let me get to the next element, which is compensation rewards. Now, I should say this is the area where you see the biggest discrepancy, the biggest variety, and I'm going to give you some examples for the kinds of principles and practices I've seen work in a variety of contexts. And as I do, keep track of how these approaches are different, but also how they're consistent in some important ways, right? So in many of the organizations that give individuals a lot of autonomy to manage their performance, that freedom is paired with skin in the game. If you're going to be given the opportunity to use your ingenuity, use your initiative productively, you get to reap the fruits of that as well. And often these rewards are not just based on your little contribution, but collective value added. That is on the performance that is a higher level than the specific person or unit you work in. We saw some of that at higher. I'm going to try to unpack that a little bit more with a few more examples. So the first comes from Nucor. They're the largest steel maker in North America. They have about 26,000 employees. They're called teammates, and they work in plants across the United States, mostly in places like Arkansas and Alabama. I visited a few of their plants. They're just amazing sites to see. And Nucor came into being as we currently see it and understand it in the late 1960s, when legendary CEO Ken Iverson took over, and he was committed to creating a company that was fundamentally more egalitarian. He basically believed that people can be entrepreneurial, can be ingenious, they can be creative everywhere in the organization, and in particular at the edge of the organization. That's where the genius is, not at the center, right? And so they have lots of ways in which they kind of instantiate this belief. Like other companies that we mentioned earlier, they have small teams, they're very empowered, but they have a very interesting compensation model for its blue collar workers. And it works like this. So the production team's compensation, and it's a team-based compensation, is tied to productivity. So the base pay of associates, the teammates there, is 70% of what the industry pays typically. But once the team's output, exceeds a particular threshold, which is typically 80% of whatever the rated capacity is for that particular piece of equipment, right? So let's say it's 100 tons a week of a particular kind of steel. That's the rated capacity. If they get to 80 of that, the production bonus starts to kick in. And there's no limit, right? So this gives team members a powerful incentive to use their ingenuity to shrink costs, speed up workflows, sweat the assets that they have to work with. And they often do this in ways that blows away the engineers who designed those machines, who never thought it would be possible to get those machines and get the workflows to be as efficient as the team has engineered them to be. And if you include the bonuses, which are paid most of the time, Nucor's factory workers earn about a quarter more than the industry peer, and it's a weekly bonus, so there's a lot of high tempo feedback, and it's also department based. So, for instance, in the melt shop department, you have different teams working on different machines. One is the furnace that gets all the scrap metal electrocuted so that it becomes like a molten soup, and then that gets brought to the caster where it's put into specific molds. All those different machines have to work together very well, and so the bonus is that for that collective team, right? So it creates a lot of peer-to-peer accountability and this willingness to help others, even though it is a performance-based bonus. It's one that isn't too parochial. Now, let me give you another example from the industrial sector, and this comes from Ingersoll Rand, which is a global leader in flow control and compression equipment. And the CEO of Vicente Reynal was committed to building an organization that where every one of its 16,000 employees thought it acted like an owner. And they took several steps to make this happen. The first is to give equity grants worth about $250 million to employees, and they did this in two stages. First in 2017, and the second in 2020, when the company acquired a bigger organization. And if you put these together, they do amount to the largest equity grants, or among the largest equity grants ever given to employees in an industrial company. They accounted for shares that were worth about 40% of someone's salary. And as this was happening, the company also flattened the pyramid, going from 10 to 4 levels of management, which is pretty remarkable for such a large organization, and much more autonomy to small teams, both in production and white-collar jobs. And this created a completely different mindset, right? So this went from the company I work for to this is my company, this is my factory, these are my machines, these are my tools, and I'm going to take care of them, right? And I thought this quote from a logistics associate sums it up pretty well, right? And the energy, the initiative, the ingenuity that has been unleashed by this has paid off handsomely, right? So I recently was talking to Vicente Reynal, and he told me that this shared ownership strategy unlocked about $3 billion in incremental value. They also lowered the turnover by about 15 points, which is pretty amazing during like the high attrition rates of the last few years in the US. And they were also able to unlock about $2.5 billion in margin expansion and higher growth, revenue growth, through the sheer ingenuity and initiative of their associates. The human impact has also been pretty remarkable. They went from about 19th percentile to the 90th percentile in Gallup's engagement rankings, and they also made big gains in workplace safety and just general loyalty and commitment to the organization. So, on top of that, there's the wealth creation components I mentioned earlier. $250 million worth of equity grants were given to people. Most of those grants were easy for people to sell if they wanted to or dispose of. Most employees have kept them, and for those who have, the value has tripled. So the total value, market value of those grants is now $750 million, which is pretty significant chunk of change. All right, now let me give you a totally different example. This is Handelsbanken, which is a large operating a bank operating in Scandinavia, but they also have a lot of branches in the UK and some in the Netherlands as well. And like other organizations I mentioned before, and this is a recurrent theme, they have a hyper decentralized model, one that yields amazing results relative to other customers. And radical decentralization and branch empowerment is a rarity in banking, but even more so is the fact that bankers are not paid individual bonuses, right? And so it's very, very different. So instead, employees participate in a company-wide profit-sharing scheme called Oktogonen, and the bank makes contribution to the scheme every year when their return on equity beats the average of their European peers, which happens like 90% of the time. And the foundation that manages this program invests most of its fund in Handelsbanken shares. And in fact, the Oktogonen is the second largest shareholder with a stake of about 2 billion. And employees receive shares every year in Oktogonen, and they're distributed equally, irrespective of title or tenure. Everybody gets the same amount. And payments from this scheme don't start until a person turns 60. So and if you spend your entire career at the bank, you might retire with 1.5 million stake in this plan. And so this is not only creates this spirit of kind of we're in all this together, yeah, but also a longer term orientation, right? Because you will ultimately be responsible for the decision the bank makes, or you'll have skin in that game when you retire, right? So that's it. That's it on compensation rewards. As you can see, very different models. Nucor has weekly bonuses. Ingersoll Rand has equity grants. Handelsbanken has a profit-sharing scheme with a very long-term orientation. Is very egalitarian. But in all these cases, there's a deliberate focus on giving people a real sense that they have skin in the game, and they're thinking about the bigger picture. Okay, last element: improvement and development. Simply put, you cannot unleash potential without clear mechanisms to improve and develop skills. So let me share a few components that I think are really important for this to happen. The first is investing in everyone's capacity to improve the business. And I mean everyone, not just the executives or the product managers. A lot of companies focus on building skills around narrow technical topics for the frontline workers, which is fine. I'm sure it's actually quite helpful. But in addition to that, companies like Nucor and Ingersoll Rand invest in developing their employees' commercial skills. So at Nucor, for instance, employees participate in a day-long monopoly-like training called Dollars and Tons, where 5-person teams run a fictitious Nucor plant, and they have to make decisions every turn on who do I hire, how many people do I hire, how much do I pay them, how much do I invest in equipment? What kind of orders should I take? What kind of inventory should I have, right? So, and at the end of the simulation, teams are assessed on profitability, return on assets, working capital management, balance sheet strength. All are obviously drivers of a plant performance. And this is a little snippet that shows a little bit some of the instructional content from their simulation. But Nucor understands that if you want people to improve the business, you need to give them the tools and the information to understand the business, right? So one of the most remarkable things that I saw in one of my Nucor mills visit was seeing in one of the cafeterias return on assets and other operating statistics, right? And everybody knew what that meant and how it affected their performance. It's truly, truly remarkable. All right. Ingersoll Rand, going back to another industrial case, did something similar when they were really keen on unlocking cash that was stuck in different elements of net working capital, whether it was inventories, accounts receivable, or accounts payable. And they were among the I think they probably were the worst performer in the industry on this net working capital score, and they needed to get much better at that in order to achieve the target. So instead of calling a consulting firm to tell them what to do, they basically trained associates on how to manage the cash conversion cycle, which isn't a super straightforward concept, but the team did a great job in translating this in ways that resonated with all employees. And for instance, the training, by the way, was about 4 sessions. Each was about 30 minutes long. They translated during these sessions unfamiliar concepts into very simple everyday terms. Managing revenues and expenses was likened to household budgeting. Inventory management was compared to stocking the pantry, things like that. And the program provided some specific tactics for different job roles. So frontline workers on the factory learned about inventory management and the impact that supply chain usage rates and spares had, right? Sales teams were equipped with strategy to improve on-time payment, and engineers were encouraged to strip out product features that customers didn't really need, which made the product simpler and less expensive. So with and less requiring of inventory and parts. So with these new tools in hand, employees mobilized, to hunt down opportunities, and within a year, they were able to drop that ratio of net working capital as percentage of sales by 6%. So, and over time, over 2 or 3 years, these kinds of efforts to improve net working capital generated another $200 million in value for the companies. It's pretty amazing what you can do, right, when you equip people with the tools and the incentives to make the right business decision. The other really important element to a system that is geared towards improvement and development is this: giving people broad roles which allow them, which give them plenty of room to grow, and these kind of are complemented with lateral communities, that enable coordination and turbocharge collective improvement. And to kind of give you an example of this, let me go back to my first case that I started with, which is Buurtzorg. So Buurtzorg nurses are fiercely generalist, right, in their approach. This allows them to provide holistic care to each client. They're not handing people over to specialists, and this not only produces better results for the clients, this doesn't fragment care, but also gives the nurses a lot of opportunity to continue to learn and master new knowledge domains and skills. So their clinical role is broad, but their breadth goes well beyond that. As I mentioned before, they're business owners. They have to find space for clients. They have to liaise with doctors and other healthcare providers. They have to ensure the economics of the business are sustainable, right? And on top of that, they're also managers, right? So each team has a housekeeper, a treasurer, a performance monitor, planner, developer, mentor. These are part-time roles that are filled by nurses who spend most of their time working with patients. So at Buurtzorg, and this is kind of an important point, the work of management doesn't go away, but it's broadly syndicated. So you actually don't need lots and lots of managers to manage, right? And one of my favorite quotes, from Buurtzorg is this: we don't have this idea that we need to climb a ladder, right? The enrichment, the increase in the advancement, in a way, comes from the work we do, from the relations with the contacts, with our clients. And this is how I would sum it up. At Buurtzorg and many other organizations that are fairly flat, employees look forward to careers of accomplishment, not kind of climbing up a ladder. Now, let me talk for a second about the potential and the importance of lateral communities at Buurtzorg and other post-bureaucratic organizations. The potential problem in having lots and lots of journalists working in their independent teams is that you might not tap into the collective expertise of the entire organization, and potentially reinventing the wheel all the time. But there are several ways in which nurses at Buurtzorg tap into the collective intelligence of their 11,000 colleagues. One of the most powerful ways to do that is via a dedicated online platform called Buurtzorg Web. And on the site, there are communities that are focused on specific disciplines like wound care or Alzheimer's, and these allow people to ask questions, codify knowledge, that could be used by other teams, right? And so you're able to access, right, this collective intelligence. On top of that, you have collaborative groups that pop up spontaneously. When I was visiting a team in Amsterdam last fall, they mentioned how they were teaming. This was in Amsterdam. They were teaming up with other local teams. There are several teams in Amsterdam, as you can imagine. It's a big city. But they all shared the same problem of recruiting young nurses or liaising with hospitals to navigate care options for their clients. And so they would come stand up spontaneous communities of collaboration where they would try to figure out what to do and craft a common approach. So you do still have collaboration and commonality across teams, but that emerges kind of bottom up and laterally. So you get all the coordination you need to improve performance where it's needed and not where it doesn't actually help. Okay, when it comes to performance management, another way to say it is lateral efforts trump vertical ones, right? So instead of pulling knowledge to the top of the organization where the expertise in theory lies, you push information authority down where the practical knowledge, expertise, and the real work kind of gets done. All right, there you have it. We've covered a ton of ground, but I hope this provided some fodder to your efforts at radically reimagining performance management. And my challenge to you especially if you're in a position of authority in HR, is to look at this list and then think about what should change, and then explore ways to do this that are radical in terms of ends, but very practical in terms of means. The way you should pursue changes is kind of experimental and user-led. Think of a management practice as a kind of a product prototype. The simple version of it could be implemented in a part of the organization. You then learn from that experiment, and then you iterate and you scale if it works. And I'm happy to get into those details during the discussion if there's interest, right? But there's a whole approach to doing this and putting this in place that is revolutionary in aspiration, but very evolutionary in terms of methods. Okay, I hope this was helpful, and I look forward to our chat and our dialogue and discussion. But I'd like to leave you with one more thought. Like, as you think about the evolution of performance management, really, really stretch yourself to aim high. As managers and leaders, we often seem to suffer from some sort of ADD, ambition deficit disorder. When contemplating changes to our organization, like performance management, we might ask, who's already done that, right? As opposed to, is it worth doing? And, if we want to create organizations that are really fit for the future and fit for the human beings inside them, we need to be more bold and more adventurous, and I can't think of a more noble goal than to make our organizations, catalysts for human flourishing. And I hope you'll embrace this goal with boldness, and I look forward to hearing about all the progress you'll be making. Otti, over to you.
Michele, thank you very, 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 very much. And I would say a big virtuous applause for Michele.